Before we begin this remarkable journey into the life of a royal guard, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss these incredible true stories that touch the heart. The morning mist hung low over the training grounds at Wellington Barracks as Thomas Pemberton stood perfectly still, his red tunic pristine against the gray London sky. 23 years old, with shoulders squared and chin raised, he embodied everything the Queen's Guard represented. But beneath that stoic exterior, his mind was racing with memories of the little boy who used to watch these very soldiers march past his grandfather's tea shop in Westminster. Thomas had grown up in the shadow of Buckingham Palace, quite literally. His grandfather, Albert Pemberton, ran a modest tea shop just 3 streets away from the palace gates. The shop had been in their family for 4 generations, serving warm cups of comfort to tourists and locals alike. Young Thomas would spend his afternoons after school helping his grandfather. Watching the guards march by through the shop's old glass windows, he was mesmerized by their discipline, their unwavering focus, their silent dedication to duty. His grandfather would often share stories while preparing tea, his weathered hands moving with practiced ease. Albert had served in the army himself during his youth, though never as a royal guard. He spoke of honor, sacrifice, and the weight of tradition with a reverence that planted seeds deep in Thomas's heart. The old man would point out different regiments, explaining their histories, their distinctions, their proud legacies. For Thomas, those afternoons were magic. Filled with dreams of standing tall in that iconic uniform, life, however, had different plans initially. Thomas's father, Robert, was a practical man who ran a small accounting firm. He had wanted Thomas to pursue business, to take over the firm one day, to have a safe and predictable future. The arguments at their dinner table grew more frequent as Thomas approached his 18th birthday. His mother, Margaret, would sit quietly, her eyes moving between her husband and son. Understanding both perspectives but unable to bridge the growing divide, the breaking point came on. Thomas's 18th birthday. His father presented him with an apprenticeship at the accounting firm, already arranged, already decided. Thomas looked at the papers, then at his grandfather's knowing eyes across the table, and made the hardest decision of his young life. He thanked his father, pushed the papers aside, and quietly announced he had already submitted his application to join the British Army with hopes of becoming a Queen's Guard. The silence that followed was deafening. His father's face turned red, his mother gasped, and his younger sister Emma stopped eating mid-bite. But his grandfather, dear old Albert, smiled the widest smile Thomas had ever seen. That smile gave him the courage to stand by his choice, even as his father stormed out of the room, even as his mother wept, even as his carefully planned future crumbled like old brick. The training was brutal. Thomas had expected discipline, but nothing prepared him for the physical and mental demands of becoming a guardsman. The instructors were relentless, the schedules exhausting, and the standards impossibly high. Many recruits dropped out in the first 3 months. Thomas thought about quitting exactly 17 times during those early days. Each time, he remembered his grandfather's smile, the pride in those old eyes, and he found the strength to continue. His father refused to speak to him for the first year. Family dinners became awkward affairs when Thomas visited home during leave. His mother would try to fill the silence with nervous chatter about neighbors and weather, while his father would read the newspaper, pointedly ignoring his son's presence. Emma, only 15 at the time, became Thomas's lifeline, sending him letters filled with encouragement and updates from home. But something unexpected happened during Thomas's 2nd year of training. His grandfather fell ill. A heart condition, the doctor said, requiring careful monitoring and reduced stress. The tea shop, Albert's pride and joy, had to close temporarily. Thomas rushed home on emergency leave, his heart heavy with worry. He found his grandfather in bed, looking smaller and frailer than he remembered. But with that same warm smile, Albert gripped Thomas's hand with surprising strength and whispered words that would stay with him forever. He told Thomas that real courage wasn't just standing still on duty or following orders. Real courage was choosing your own path when the world demanded otherwise. He spoke of regrets from his own youth, chances not taken, dreams deferred for practicality. He made Thomas promise to see his training through, to stand guard, not just for the Queen, but for every dream that seemed impossible. 3 weeks later, Albert passed away peacefully in his sleep. Thomas was granted leave to attend the funeral. He stood in his dress uniform, a testament to the dreams his grandfather had helped nurture, and delivered a eulogy that left no dry eye in the small church. Even his father wept, perhaps seeing for the first time what this path truly meant to his son. The reading of the will brought another surprise. Albert had left the tea shop to Thomas, not to his son Robert. The old man's letter explained that he trusted Thomas to understand what the shop represented, the history it held, the comfort it provided to weary souls. He wrote that a good guardsman protects more than palaces. He protects tradition, memory, and the simple joys that make life worth living. Thomas stood in the empty shop after everyone left, surrounded by his grandfather's legacy, and understood that his journey was about more than just wearing a uniform. It was about honoring the past while serving the present. Thomas completed his training with honors, earning his place among the elite Queen's Guard the day he first stood outside Buckingham Palace in full ceremonial dress was one of profound emotion. His mother and sister attended the ceremony, beaming with pride. His father came too, standing at the back of the crowd. And though he said nothing, Thomas caught him wiping his eyes when he thought no one was watching. The reality of being a royal guard was different from what tourists imagined. Yes, Thomas stood motionless for hours, his bearskin hat weighing heavily, his feet aching, his muscles screaming for movement. But what people never understood was the mental discipline required. During those long hours of standing watch, his mind had to remain alert, observing everything while appearing to notice nothing. He learned to track movements in his peripheral vision, to identify potential threats, to maintain absolute composure regardless of what happened around him. Tourists would do everything to make him react. Children would make faces, adults would tell jokes. Some would stand uncomfortably close trying to get a response. Thomas learned to retreat into a place of inner calm, a technique taught by one of his senior officers. He would think about his grandfather's tea shop, mentally walking through each room, remembering the smell of Earl Grey and chamomile, the sound of the kettle whistling, the warmth of conversations shared over steaming cups. The tea shop itself remained closed for nearly 6 months. After his grandfather's death, Thomas didn't know what to do with it. He was committed to his duties as a guardsman, unable to run a business on the side. The property taxes were mounting, and practical considerations suggested selling it. His father, having recovered somewhat from their estrangement, offered to buy it and convert it into an office space. The offer was generous, but something in Thomas's heart resisted. One evening, during his off-duty hours, Thomas sat alone in the empty shop. Dust covered the counters, the old tea canisters were empty, and silence filled the space where laughter and conversation once lived. He ran his fingers along the worn wooden counter, feeling the grooves created by 4 generations of Pembertons serving tea. That's when inspiration struck him with the force of revelation. What if the shop could serve the guards? Thomas knew his fellow guardsmen faced their own struggles. The job was demanding, isolating at times, and mentally exhausting. Many lived far from family, missed important events, and dealt with the stress of constant public scrutiny. They needed a place to decompress, to connect, to remember they were human beings beneath those red tunics and bearskin hats. Thomas proposed his idea to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, a stern man with 30 years of service. Harrison listened quietly as Thomas explained his vision for reopening his grandfather's tea shop as a haven for guardsmen, a place where they could gather off duty, share their experiences, find community among those who understood the unique demands of their role. Harrison was skeptical at first, citing regulations and protocols. But Thomas was persistent. The breakthrough came when Harrison visited the shop himself. The old soldier stood in the doorway, and Thomas watched his expression soften as he took in the worn but welcoming space. Harrison shared that his own father had run a pub that served soldiers, a place where warriors could lower their guard and just be men again. He understood immediately what Thomas was trying to preserve and create. With Harrison's support, Thomas navigated the complex approval process. He needed permission from multiple authorities, had to ensure the shop met various regulations, and needed to figure out the logistics of running a business while serving as a full-time guardsman. His sister Emma, now studying business management at university, volunteered to help manage the shop during his duty hours. The transformation took 3 months. Thomas and Emma worked during his off-duty time, cleaning, repairing, and restoring the shop to its former glory. They kept Albert's original tea blends, his recipes for scones and biscuits, its comfortable mismatched chairs that invited people to stay and talk. But they added new elements too. A wall of photographs showing guards through the decades. A quiet corner with comfortable chairs for reading or contemplation. And a small library of books donated by families of current and former guardsmen. The day they reopened, Thomas was on duty at the palace. Emma managed the shop alone, nervous but determined. She had prepared Albert's famous English breakfast tea and fresh scones. She wasn't sure anyone would come. The shop was off the main tourist routes, and she had only spread word through Thomas's fellow guardsmen. At 2 in the afternoon, the bell above the door chimed. 3 guardsmen entered, still in their uniforms, having just finished their shifts. They looked around uncertainly until Emma welcomed them with her brightest smile, offering them tea on the house for the opening day. They sat down hesitantly, and Emma brought them the tea service exactly as her grandfather had taught her, with proper china cups and small sandwiches. Within an hour, 2 more guardsmen arrived, then 3 more. By the time Thomas finished his duty and arrived at the shop that evening, it was filled with red tunics, laughter, and the blessed sound of men being themselves without the weight of public expectation. Some were reading newspapers, some were playing chess at a corner table Emma had set up. Others were simply sitting quietly with their tea. Finally able to relax, Thomas stood in the doorway, much as Harrison had done weeks before, and felt his eyes well with tears. His grandfather's legacy was alive again, but transformed into something even more meaningful. It wasn't just a tea shop anymore. It was a sanctuary, a bridge between duty and humanity. A place where the silent watchers could finally speak. One of the older guardsmen, a man named William Davies, who had served for 15 years, approached Thomas that evening. Davies was known for his stoic demeanor, rarely showing emotion even among fellow soldiers. He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder and said simply, "Your grandfather would be proud. You've given us something we didn't know we needed, a place to remember who we are beneath the uniform." Those words meant more to Thomas than any medal or commendation. The shop became his second duty, as important as his watch at the palace gates. He realized that protecting and serving took many forms. Standing guard at Buckingham Palace protected the monarchy and the nation's traditions. But creating and maintaining this humble tea shop protected something equally important: the spirits and sanity of the men who stood that guard. The tea shop flourished over the following year, becoming a cherished institution among the guards. Word spread through the ranks, and guardsmen from different regiments began visiting. Emma managed the daily operations with unexpected skill, discovering she had inherited her great-grandfather's natural hospitality. She learned each regular's preferred tea, remembered their stories, and created an atmosphere where hardened soldiers felt comfortable sharing their struggles and joys. Thomas's relationship with his father also began healing during this time. Robert started visiting the shop on Saturday mornings, initially claiming he was just checking on Emma, but Thomas noticed his father lingering, observing the guardsman with something like understanding in his eyes. One morning, Robert arrived early and asked if he could help with the accounts. The shop's finances were a mess, Thomas admitted. As neither he nor Emma had much head for numbers, father and son sat together at a small table. Ledgers spread between them, working in comfortable silence punctuated by occasional questions. Robert showed Thomas how to organize expenses, track inventory, and plan for slow seasons. It wasn't an apology, but it was something perhaps better. A father and son finding common ground through service to something larger than their disagreement. During one of these Saturday sessions, Robert shared a story Thomas had never heard. Robert's own father, Albert, had wanted him to join the military to continue the family's tradition of service. But Robert had been terrified of combat, of violence, of the very things that defined military life. Choosing accounting had been his rebellion, his way of forging his own path. He had seen Thomas's choice to join the Guards as a rejection of everything Robert had built. But now he understood it differently. Thomas wasn't rejecting his father. He was honoring his grandfather while being true to himself, exactly as Robert had done a generation before. The shop attracted attention beyond the Guards. A journalist named Sarah Mitchell from a small London newspaper heard about the tea shop and requested an interview. Thomas was hesitant, protective of the haven they'd created, worried that publicity might destroy its intimate atmosphere. But Lieutenant Colonel Harrison encouraged him, suggesting that sharing their story might help the public understand the human beings behind the ceremonial uniforms. Sarah arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, expecting a quick interview for a small human interest piece. Instead, she found herself captivated by the stories she heard. Guardsmen spoke openly about the challenges of their role, the mental discipline required, the isolation they sometimes felt, and how this small shop had become essential to their well-being. One young guard, barely 19, spoke about missing his mother's cooking and how Emma's scones reminded him of home. An older guard described dealing with divorce while maintaining perfect composure on duty, and how the shop gave him a place to process his grief. Sarah's article ran the following: Sunday, and touched something deep in the public consciousness, titled "The Guards Who Guard Can Rest." It painted an intimate portrait of the men behind the bearskin hats and the tea shop that served as their refuge. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from across Britain, from veterans who understood, from families of guardsmen grateful for the shop's existence, from ordinary citizens moved by the story, but fame brought complications. Tourists began seeking out the shop, wanting to photograph guardsmen drinking tea, turning the sanctuary into a spectacle. Emma had to make the difficult decision to establish new policies. The shop would be open to the public 3 days a week, but 4 days would be reserved exclusively for guardsmen and their families. Some tourists complained, leaving negative reviews online. But the guardsmen appreciated the protection of their space. One winter evening, something happened that would test everything Thomas had built. A young guardsman named Christopher Hughes arrived at the shop during a private evening, visibly shaken. His hands trembled as Emma poured him tea, and he couldn't seem to speak. Thomas sat beside him quietly, waiting, understanding that sometimes the greatest support was simple presence. After nearly an hour, Christopher's story emerged. During his duty that afternoon, a tourist had become aggressive, pushing past barriers and rushing toward him. Christopher had to break his statuesque stance, call for backup, and help restrain the individual. Protocol had been followed perfectly, but the incident had shattered something in Christopher. He kept replaying the moment, questioning his reactions, drowning in adrenaline aftershock. Other guardsmen in the shop gathered around, each sharing their own difficult moments. William Davies spoke about the time a child had been separated from parents in a crowd, and how he'd broken protocol to alert other officers. Another guard described the internal battle of maintaining composure when he'd received news of his grandmother's death while on duty. They weren't just sharing stories. They were normalizing the struggle, reminding Christopher that being affected by intense moments didn't make him weak. It made him human. Thomas watched this organic support system function and realized the shop had become something beyond his grandfather's, a vision or his own intentions. It had evolved into a brotherhood sanctuary, a place where the strong could be vulnerable, where the silent could speak, where the watchers could be watched over. That night, after everyone had left and Emma had gone home, Thomas stayed to clean up. As he wiped down tables and organized chairs, his phone rang. It was his mother, calling with news that his father had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains. Thomas's world tilted. Despite their reconciliation, relationships with parents always held complicated layers, and the thought of losing his father before fully mending their bond terrified him. He rushed to the hospital. Still wearing his casual clothes, smelling faintly of tea and lemon, his mother and Emma were in the waiting room, Emma's eyes red from crying. The next few hours were agonizing, waiting for doctors, for news, for any information. Thomas found himself praying, something he hadn't done since childhood, bargaining with whatever forces might listen. His father survived. A warning, the doctors called it. Not a full heart attack, but serious enough to require lifestyle changes and careful monitoring. When Thomas was finally allowed to see him, Robert looked small in the hospital bed, vulnerable in a way Thomas had never witnessed. His father reached for his hand, gripping it with surprising strength. Robert spoke quietly, his voice rough with emotion and medication. He told Thomas he was proud, not just of the guardsman he'd become, but of the man who'd honored his grandfather by creating something meaningful. He apologized for the years of silence, for the birthday that had driven a wedge between them, for not understanding sooner that there were many ways to serve, to build, to matter. Thomas felt tears sliding down his cheeks. No longer the stoic guard, but simply a son, grateful for his father's life and words. They sat together in that sterile hospital room, hands clasped, years of misunderstanding finally dissolved. Outside, London continued its endless rhythm, but in that moment, time seemed to pause for healing. Robert's health scare changed the family dynamic permanently. He became a regular presence at the tea shop, not just managing accounts but actually serving customers. The former businessman discovered an unexpected joy in the simple act of brewing tea and listening to people's stories. Customers who knew nothing of his identity as Thomas's father appreciated the quiet, competent man who remembered their orders and asked thoughtful questions about their days. The shop became a true family enterprise. Margaret, Thomas's mother, began baking for the shop using Albert's old recipes that she'd watched him prepare countless times. Her Victoria sponge cake became legendary among the guardsmen, and she would arrive twice weekly with fresh baked goods, her face glowing with purpose. Emma balanced her university studies with managing operations, discovering a business acumen that impressed even her father. Thomas himself found a rhythm between his dual roles. His duty as a Queen's Guard gave him structure, discipline, and a sense of serving something greater than himself. The tea shop gave him connection, community, and a way to honor his grandfather's memory while supporting his brothers in arms. The combination felt complete, like two halves of his purpose finally unified, but challenges continued to emerge. One spring morning, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison requested a private meeting with Thomas. His expression was serious as he closed his office door, and Thomas's stomach tightened with worry. Harrison explained that some senior officers had raised concerns about the shop. They worried it might be creating too casual an atmosphere among the guards, potentially undermining the discipline and formality essential to their role. Thomas felt his carefully built world trembling. He explained passionately that the shop didn't weaken discipline, but strengthened it. Guards who had a place to process stress, to connect with peers, to remember their humanity actually performed better on duty. They were more focused, more resilient, more capable of maintaining the extraordinary composure their role demanded. Harrison listened, his weathered face thoughtful. The lieutenant colonel asked,
"Act, Thomas."
To prepare a formal presentation for the senior command staff. He had 2 weeks to make his case, to prove that the tea shop enhanced rather than compromised the guard's effectiveness. Thomas left the office feeling both terrified and determined. Everything he'd built, everything his grandfather had envisioned, hung in the balance. He spent his off-duty hours gathering evidence. He interviewed guardsmen about how the shop affected their performance, their mental health, their commitment to duty. He compiled testimonials, collected data on retention rates among guards who frequented the shop versus those who didn't, and researched military studies about the importance of peer support systems. Emma helped him organize the information into a clear, compelling presentation. The night before his presentation, Thomas couldn't sleep. He sat in the shop long after closing, surrounded by the space that had come to mean so much to so many people. William Davies found him there, the older guardsman having noticed lights on past closing time. Davies sat down without asking, and Emma, who'd been helping her brother prepare, brought them both tea. Davies shared his own story that night, details he'd never spoken aloud before. He described the breakdown he'd suffered 5 years earlier, the depression that had nearly ended his career, the isolation that had made everything worse. If a place like this shop had existed then, he said, he might have avoided years of suffering. He told Thomas that the shop wasn't just nice to have. For some guardsmen, it was literally life-saving. The presentation took place in a formal conference room at the barracks. Thomas stood before 5 senior officers, his dress uniform perfectly pressed, his evidence carefully organized. He was more nervous than he'd been at any point during his training or service. These men held the power to shut down everything he'd created. He began by talking about his grandfather, about a man who understood that strength required balance, that discipline needed release, that service demanded support. He presented his research, his testimonials, his data, but more importantly, he spoke from his heart about what he'd witnessed. Guards who were struggling, finding hope. Isolated young men discovering brotherhood. Veterans teaching newer guards not just about protocol, but about surviving the unique pressures of their role. One senior officer, Colonel Richards, known for his traditional views and stern demeanor, interrupted Thomas's presentation. The room went silent, and Thomas's heart sank. But Richards didn't voice opposition. Instead, he shared that his own son had served as a guardsman and had struggled terribly with the mental demands. His son had left the service early, unable to cope with the isolation and pressure. Richards's voice cracked slightly as he said he wished something like, Thomas's shop had existed for his son. The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. The shop would continue operating with official recognition as a sanctioned support facility for the guards. More than that, the command staff agreed to promote awareness of the shop among all new guardsmen, ensuring they knew the resource existed. Thomas felt his knees weaken with relief as Harrison shook his hand, pride evident in the older man's eyes. The shop's official recognition brought new opportunities and responsibilities. The military allocated a small budget for the shop's operations, ensuring it could remain affordable for all guardsmen regardless of their financial situations. Emma was offered a formal position as manager, which she accepted, deciding to put her university studies on hold temporarily to focus on the work she'd come to love. They expanded slightly, taking over the adjacent vacant storefront and creating additional space. The new room became a quiet zone, a place for reading, contemplation, or just sitting in peace. They added a small counseling area where guardsmen could meet privately with military, mental health professionals who began offering regular visiting hours. One evening, an elderly woman appeared at the shop just before closing. She was dressed elegantly, her white hair perfectly styled, and she carried herself with unmistakable dignity. Emma greeted her courteously, explaining they were about to close, but she was welcome to a quick cup of tea. The woman smiled and said she wasn't there for tea. She was there to meet Thomas. Thomas emerged from the back room, confused but courteous. The woman introduced herself simply as Elizabeth Morrison. She explained that her late husband had served as a Queen's Guard in the 1960s. He'd struggled with the isolation and pressure, and it had affected him throughout his life. She'd read about the tea shop, about what Thomas and his family had created, and she wanted to thank him personally. More than that, she wanted to contribute. Elizabeth revealed that she was quite wealthy, her husband having built a successful business after his military service. She had no children, and she wanted her legacy to support something meaningful. She offered to establish a trust fund for the shop, ensuring it could continue operating indefinitely, could expand if needed, and could always remain affordable for guardsmen regardless of military budget fluctuations. Thomas was overwhelmed. He tried to express gratitude but found himself speechless, tears streaming down his face. This woman, this stranger, believed so deeply in what they'd created that she wanted to secure its future permanently. Emma hugged the woman spontaneously, and Elizabeth laughed. The sound bright with joy and purpose. The trust fund was established within weeks. Elizabeth became a regular visitor to the shop, often sitting quietly in the corner with her own tea, simply watching the guardsmen and smiling with satisfaction. She told Thomas once that watching these young men find comfort in community helped heal something in her own heart, some old wound carried from watching her beloved husband struggle alone. 3 years after reopening his grandfather's shop, Thomas stood at a crossroads in his own life. He'd served with distinction as a Queen's Guard, earned promotions, and gained deep respect from his peers. But he'd also poured his heart into the tea shop, watching it grow into something that served dozens of guardsmen daily. The question of where his future lay kept him awake many nights. The decision point came unexpectedly. During a routine medical examination, the military doctor noted unusual stress on Thomas's knees and back, common issues for guards who stood motionless for extended periods. While not immediately serious, the doctor warned that continuing the physically demanding guard duties for many more years could lead to chronic problems. Thomas was advised to consider transitioning to a less physically intensive military role or retiring from active guard duty. The news hit Thomas harder than he expected. Being a Queen's Guard had been his identity for years, the dream he'd fought for, the role that had defined him. The thought of giving it up felt like losing a part of himself. He sat in the shop that evening after his shift, still in uniform, staring at nothing while Emma quietly worked around him. William Davies found him there, as he so often did during Thomas's difficult moments. The older guardsman had become something of a mentor, his 15 years of service giving him perspective Thomas needed. Davies shared that every guardsman eventually faced this transition, this moment of moving beyond the ceremonial role. The key was remembering that being a guard was something you did, not something you were. The values, the discipline, the commitment to service, those remained regardless of uniform. Over the following weeks, Thomas wrestled with his decision. He talked with his family, his fellow guardsmen, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, and even Elizabeth Morrison, who'd become a beloved fixture in his life. Each conversation added another layer to his understanding. His mother pointed out that he could serve the guards differently, but no less meaningfully. His father noted that sometimes the bravest choice was knowing when to evolve rather than stubbornly clinging to one role. Emma's perspective proved most illuminating. She reminded Thomas that their grandfather had never actually served as a royal guard. Yet he'd served guardsmen faithfully for decades through his tea shop. Service took many forms, and perhaps Thomas's greatest contribution wasn't his time-standing sentry, but his creation of a sanctuary that would outlast any individual service period. Thomas made his decision with both sadness and peace. He would complete his current service term and then retire from active duty as a Queen's Guard. He would dedicate himself fully to the tea shop, expanding its mission and ensuring it could serve future generations of guardsmen. It wasn't giving up his dream. It was allowing his dream to evolve into something even more meaningful. His final day of active duty was marked with a small ceremony. Fellow guardsmen gathered in their dress uniforms, and Lieutenant Colonel Harrison presented Thomas with a commendation for his exceptional service. But the moment that moved Thomas most was when Christopher Hughes, the young guard who'd arrived shaken at the shop years earlier, stepped forward. Christopher had thrived since that difficult evening, becoming one of the most reliable guardsmen in his unit. He thanked Thomas publicly, crediting both Thomas's example on duty and the shop's existence with helping him find his way. The transition wasn't easy. Thomas struggled initially with no longer wearing the uniform, no longer standing watch, no longer being an active guardsman. He felt adrift, questioning his identity and purpose. But gradually, as he threw himself into developing the shop's programs and services, he found a new sense of purpose that felt just as important. They established a formal mentorship program, pairing experienced guardsmen with new recruits. They created workshops on managing stress, maintaining relationships during demanding service, and planning for life after guard duty. They started a small library of resources about military mental health, career transitions, and veteran services. The shop evolved from just a tea room into a comprehensive support center, while maintaining its cozy, welcoming atmosphere. One autumn afternoon, a young man barely 18 years old appeared at the shop's doorway, looking uncertain and overwhelmed. He wore civilian clothes but carried himself with an attempt at military bearing. Emma greeted him warmly. He explained haltingly that he was about to begin training to become a Queen's Guard. He'd heard about the shop, about Thomas's story, and he wanted to meet the man who'd served with such dedication while creating something meaningful for his brothers in arms. Thomas sat with this young man, whose name was Daniel, and saw himself at that age. The same dreams, the same determination, the same mixture of excitement and fear. They talked for 2 hours. Thomas sharing not just the glory and pride of being a guard, but the real challenges, the mental demands, the importance of finding balance and support. He told Daniel about the shop, about the community waiting for him, about the fact that asking for help wasn't weakness but wisdom. Daniel left that day with Thomas's personal phone number and an open invitation to visit the shop anytime during his training or service. More importantly, he left understanding that becoming a Queen's Guard meant joining a brotherhood that would support him through every challenge. 6 months later, Daniel completed his training and stood his first watch at Buckingham Palace. That evening, he came to the shop, still in uniform, his face beaming with pride and exhaustion. Thomas poured him tea using his grandfather's china. They toasted to duty, service, the beginning of Daniel's journey. The shop's reputation spread beyond just the guards. Other military units began inquiring about replicating the model. Thomas found himself consulting with various military branches about establishing similar support spaces for their personnel. He never charged for these consultations, considering it part of his continued service. Several successful ventures opened across Britain, each adapted to their specific military community, but all sharing the core principle that warriors needed places to be human. Elizabeth Morrison's health began declining in the 4th year after Thomas left active duty. She was nearly 805, and time was taking its inevitable toll. She spent her final months visiting the shop almost daily, arriving in a wheelchair pushed by a devoted caretaker. She would sit in her favorite corner, sipping tea and watching the guardsmen with a gentle smile. She told Thomas once that these visits were the highlight of her days, that knowing her husband's struggles had contributed to something healing brought her profound peace. When Elizabeth passed quietly in her sleep, she left specific instructions for her funeral. She wanted it held not in a grand church but in the tea shop itself, surrounded by the guardsmen she'd come to love and support. The shop closed for a day, transformed into a memorial space filled with flowers and photographs. Dozens of guardsmen attended, current and former, many speaking about how Elizabeth's generosity had touched their lives indirectly through the shop's continued operation. Thomas delivered the eulogy, his voice steady despite his grief. He spoke about a woman who transformed personal pain into communal healing, who'd understood that the best way to honor those we've lost is to ensure others don't suffer the same struggles. He announced that the shop's quiet contemplation room would be renamed the Elizabeth Morrison Peace Room, a permanent tribute to her legacy. The funeral reception afterward was unlike any Thomas had experienced. Instead of somber whispers, the shop filled with stories and laughter as people shared memories of Elizabeth and celebrated her life. Guardsmen spoke about how the shop had helped them, how Elizabeth's vision had quite literally saved some of their careers and possibly their lives. It was a celebration of impact, of one woman's choice to transform grief into grace. 5 years after Thomas retired from active guard duty, the shop had become an institution woven into the fabric of the guard community. Morning shifts changed, and guardsmen would stop by afterward, their bearskin hats placed carefully on designated hooks, their red tunics a familiar sight among the shop's worn wooden furniture. New guards learned about the shop during their first week of training, and visiting became an unofficial rite of passage. Thomas, now 31, had grown into his role as keeper of this sanctuary. His military bearing never left him, but he'd developed a warmth and openness that made even the most reserved guardsmen feel comfortable sharing their struggles. He could read the signs of stress in a man's posture, recognize when someone needed conversation versus comfortable silence, and knew instinctively when to offer Earl Grey versus chamomile. Emma had blossomed into a remarkable manager, eventually completing her business degree through evening classes while running the shop. She'd fallen in love with one of the regular guardsmen, a kind man named James, who managed to make her laugh even during the busiest shifts. Their wedding was held in a small church near the palace, and the reception took place in the shop naturally. Guardsmen formed an honor corridor with their ceremonial swords, and Thomas walked his sister down the aisle with tears of joy streaming down his face. His parents had become integral to the shop's daily life. Robert managed all the business affairs with meticulous care, ensuring the shop remained financially stable while keeping prices affordable for guardsmen. Margaret's baking had become legendary. She'd begun teaching some of the younger guardsmen's wives and girlfriends her recipes, creating an extended community around the shop. The family that had once been fractured by Thomas's choice had been made whole again through shared purpose. One spring morning, Thomas received an unexpected phone call from the palace's administrative office. They requested his presence for a meeting regarding a matter of some importance. Thomas arrived at the designated office, his heart pounding with uncertainty. He was ushered into a sitting room, where he found himself face to face with a senior member of the royal household. The official explained that the royal family had become aware of the tea shop and its significance to the guards. They appreciated Thomas's dedication to the well-being of those who served the crown. In recognition of his service both as a guardsman and as creator of this vital support system, Thomas was being invited to a private reception at the palace, where he would be formally recognized for his contributions. Thomas stood speechless, overwhelmed by the honor. The official smiled and added that the Queen herself had specifically requested that the shop's story be documented and shared more widely, believing it represented the best of British values: service, community, and caring for those who serve. Thomas managed to stammer his thanks, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what was being offered. The reception took place on a golden summer evening. Thomas wore his old dress uniform, which still fit perfectly thanks to his maintained discipline. His entire family attended, his parents dressed in their finest, Emma and James beaming with pride, and even William Davies and several other guardsmen who'd become like brothers to him. They were guided through the palace's magnificent halls, and Thomas found himself remembering the young boy who'd watched guards march by his grandfather's shop window, dreaming impossible dreams. The ceremony was intimate and personal. Thomas was presented with a commendation for his service to the guards and the broader military community. But the moment that stopped his heart was when he was introduced to a member of the royal family, who thanked him personally for creating a space that honored both tradition and humanity. They spoke about Albert, about the legacy of service that ran through Thomas's family, and about how the shop represented the very best of what community could be. Photographs were taken, and Thomas knew he was living through a moment he'd treasure forever. But more meaningful than any official recognition was what happened after the ceremony. Several palace staff members, people who worked behind the scenes supporting the guards and the royal household, approached Thomas privately. They thanked him for the shop, explaining that their loved ones who served as guards had been helped immeasurably by having such a sanctuary. One woman, tears in her eyes, explained that the shop had quite possibly saved her son's life during a period of severe depression. Returning to the shop that evening, still wearing his uniform, Thomas found it filled with guardsmen who'd heard about the recognition. They'd organized an impromptu celebration, complete with Margaret's cakes and Robert's carefully managed champagne budget. The shop rang with laughter, stories, and the kind of genuine camaraderie that can only exist among those who've shared difficult experiences and found support in each other. Daniel, the young man who had visited before his training years earlier, was now a confident guardsman himself. He stood and proposed a toast to Thomas, calling him the guardian of the guardians, the man who protected those who stood watch. The title stuck. Thomas found himself both embarrassed and deeply moved by the sentiment. As the celebration wound down and guardsmen filtered out into the London night, Thomas stayed behind to clean up. His father joined him, the two men working in comfortable silence, wiping tables and arranging chairs. Robert paused at one point. Looking around the shop with evident satisfaction, his father spoke quietly, admitting that he'd been wrong all those years ago. He'd thought Thomas was throwing away security and practical success for romantic notions of honor and service. But he understood now that Thomas had built something more valuable than any accounting firm could ever be. He'd created a legacy of compassion, a sanctuary that would serve people for generations. Robert's voice cracked as he said he couldn't be more proud of the man his son had become. Thomas embraced his father. Both men holding tight, years of complicated history finally resolved into simple love and mutual respect. It was a moment of completion, of wounds finally healed, of a family finding its way back to wholeness through unexpected paths. The shop continued its work, Day after day, year after year, new guardsmen discovered it and found community. Struggling veterans found support. Young men far from home found comfort in Margaret's cakes and Emma's welcoming smile. The walls accumulated more photographs, more stories, more evidence of lives touched and helped. Thomas eventually wrote a book about his grandfather, the shop, and the guardsmen who'd made it meaningful. The proceeds went entirely to expanding mental health services for active and former military personnel. The book found a wide audience, touching people who'd never met a guardsman but understood the universal need for community, support, in places where we can be authentically ourselves. On the 10th anniversary of the shop's reopening, they held a celebration that drew guardsmen from across the decades. Men who'd served in the 60s and 70s came, along with current guards, barely out of training. The shop couldn't hold everyone, so they spilled out into the street, which the local council had agreed to close for the evening. 3 generations of guardsmen mixed and talked. Sharing stories that spanned 50 years of service, Thomas stood in the doorway of his grandfather's shop, watching this living tapestry of service and community, and felt Albert's presence almost tangibly. He imagined his grandfather watching from wherever spirits go, seeing how his simple tea shop had evolved into something neither of them could have fully imagined. The dream hadn't been just Thomas's or Albert's. It had been shaped by every guardsman who'd walked through that door, every family member who'd contributed, every person who'd understood that true strength required places of vulnerability. As the evening stars appeared above London, Thomas made his way through the crowd, shaking hands, embracing friends, listening to stories. He was no longer a young man chasing dreams, but a man who'd found his purpose in the intersection of honor and humanity, tradition and compassion, service and community. The shop's lights glowed warm against the darkening sky, a beacon for those who stood silent watch. A reminder that even the strongest among us need places to rest, to speak, to simply be. And in that light, in that warmth, in that carefully tended space of welcome and understanding, Albert's legacy lived on, transformed and expanded but true to its original heart, offering comfort, one cup at a time, to those who serve,